I think there are more and more of us who are now starting to realize just how badly we need to end these lockdowns. I live in Los Angeles, where the government made it illegal for me to do my work for most of 2020. And as of January 2021, they're still continuing to force my business and many others to stay closed. It doesn't matter how many safety precautions we take, with masks and gloves and sanitation. It doesn't matter if we've been tested or if we're already immune to it. It doesn't matter if the employees and the customers decide that the benefit of being able to go to work and to go out in the world outweighs the potential risk of catching COVID, a risk which is tiny, by the way, for many people. None of these things matter to the government. They have decided that forced lockdowns are the right thing to do, and 2 weeks to flatten the curve has now been extended into nearly a year. So how on earth do we get out of this? With the vaccine rollout now underway, there does seem to be a general assumption that this is going to be the thing that allows us to finally get back to our lives. But unfortunately, I would argue that that is not a safe assumption to make. And it's not just because COVID could still be around even after the vaccine. In fact, that's not even the primary reason why the lockdowns could keep dragging on. In order to answer the question of how do we get out of this, we first need to fully understand how we actually got here. And there's a fundamental idea that many of us have accepted that has enabled governments to respond to the virus by shutting us down in the first place. And that idea is collectivism. Collectivism is the idea that individuals shouldn't be primarily concerned with pursuing what's right for them according to their own needs and values, but rather that individuals should give up their values and act instead toward goals that are prescribed to them by a group. It doesn't take long to see just how widespread this idea is within the political talk around COVID. Notice how the debate is mostly centered around whether lockdowns are effective or not at reducing total COVID deaths. The implicit assumption made by both sides within the debate is that if they are effective at that, then they're justified. But notice what this premise assumes, that you and everyone else are incapable of making your own decisions in life. There's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done between the risk of potentially being exposed to COVID versus suffering the negative effects of isolating away from life and from other people, and in many cases being unable to work. Collectivism holds that this isn't your decision to make. The government will decide what is the proper balance of saving lives versus saving the economy, and it'll command everyone to adopt the same standard of behavior regardless of one's own individual needs. And as a result of this, many people are now being forced, against their consent, to endure massive sacrifices of their quality of life in order to avoid a virus that would most likely pass over them like a common cold. The people who are most at risk of dying from COVID are those over the age of 65. This age group accounts for only 16% of the population, but 80% of all COVID deaths. What's also true is that 80% of people over the age of 65 are retired, meaning that they have the ability to comfortably stay home if they want to avoid risking COVID. The mortality rate is 5.4% for those who are 70 and older. Many of these people will feel that this risk justifies avoiding non-essential trips outside the home, or avoiding friends and family, or even isolating themselves entirely. But many others would much prefer to take that relatively unlikely risk if it means that they get to continue living a full life. Every year is precious, especially to an older person who may not have very many more years ahead of them. If they want to spend time with their friends and family, to celebrate the holidays instead of canceling them, to have the freedom to go out into the world and live life to the fullest, they have every right in a free society to make that subjective decision for themselves. The standard of life has never been zero risk. As long as people have the freedom to live their lives, they will encounter certain risks, and a fraction of them will die. But most will live, and they'll live much fuller lives than if they'd spent all their time just worrying about avoiding death. If the problem is that life requires risk, the solution isn't to force everyone to stop living. Now, for a working age person, it makes even less sense to be forced to follow COVID restrictions. The survival rate for this group is virtually 100%. It's 99.98% for anybody under 50. and 99.5% for those who are 50 to 69 years old. It is an outrageous injustice for these people to have to lose their jobs, their businesses, and all their savings, to be set back potentially by years in the course of their lives, to watch helplessly as some of their favorite places close down forever, to be unable to go out, live life, and pursue their own happiness, to have a sinking feeling of dread about the future as the national debt explodes and freedom erodes, to develop new health problems like obesity, drug addiction, and mental disease, whose worst negative effects won't even be seen until years or decades later. The fact that this age group has been forced to sacrifice so much liberty in exchange for virtually no safety is probably the most obvious example of how these broad-brush collectivist policies end up causing massive harm by denying people the freedom to act according to their own interests. But what about the long-term negative effects of COVID? After all, not everybody who survives actually makes a full recovery, right? If you look at the data, it shows that 13.3% of people still have symptoms after 4 weeks. After 12 weeks, that number drops down to 2.3%. So as time goes on, the body tends to heal itself, and the number of people still experiencing negative effects starts to go down further and further. Now, there are some people who have continued to be ill for months without ever fully recovering, but those cases are the exception and not the rule. And recently, there's been an effective treatment protocol that's been discovered, which can help those who are still suffering from long COVID. For more info about this, I'd recommend RUN-DMC's video, First Effective Treatment for Long COVID, Stunning Data from Huge New Study. I'll put a link in the description. Long COVID doesn't have to become permanent, and it doesn't have to become a reason to support continued lockdowns instead of reopening the world. But what about the hospitals? After all, if large amounts of people start catching COVID all at once, won't the ICUs become so overwhelmed that they'd be unable to accept all the patients? Isn't this the reason why we still need lockdowns? I think we need to be looking at this from a completely different perspective. The real problem is that the current healthcare system is not able to take in a large number of patients during an emergency. If the supply of healthcare is not enough to meet the demand, it only makes sense to talk about increasing the supply. These photos were taken at a hospital just east of Los Angeles. They showed tents being set up for treating patients in the parking lot because the emergency rooms had been completely overwhelmed by a wave of sick patients. These photos were taken in 2018 during flu season. If this is how easily the hospitals can reach a breaking point, then clearly something has to change. California enacted some of the longest and strictest lockdowns in the whole country, and they still have ended up with ICU capacity hitting 0. Meanwhile, Florida has been completely open since September, and they haven't experienced any kind of catastrophic overwhelming of the hospitals over there. Until we adopt a more individualistic mentality, we will be at risk of the lockdowns continuing indefinitely. There's no guarantee that the vaccine will make COVID disappear forever, but we can make the lockdowns end whenever we choose. Places like Florida, Texas, and South Dakota have already rejected further shutdowns. They're leaving people free to make their own evaluations about what's right for them. Nobody is forcing anyone to visit so-called non-essential businesses, or to enter stores that don't require masks, or to stand closer than 6 feet to other people, or to attend parties or weddings or concerts, or even to leave home at all. In these states, you're still free to protect yourself from COVID as much as you want. A free society allows every individual to create their own path in life. The only question is, are we willing to reclaim our rights, or will we allow ourselves to be entirely at the mercy of the state?